there is an architectural pattern that splits the medieval cathedral churches of England into two groups. This pattern is all the more interesting because it maps directly onto the type of institution that served these foundations, suggesting interesting things for the relationship between institution and architecture. In this paper, I firstly want to argue that the pattern itself exists. I also want to suggest what I currently believe to be its principal cause, but around these two actually relatively simple points, I also want to make various more speculative, even ruminative observations about institution and architecture in the Middle Ages. This is an inquiry that sits midway between two disciplines, architectural and institutional history. Whether that means it falls uselessly between two stools or illuminates both areas, I leave my audience to judge. I must confess to having woken up in a cold sweat many times as I myself swing from one position to the other, and in the end it seemed that throwing myself on the mercy of the only audience, in Britain qualified to comment seemed the only practical way forwards. So here I am. There is a sense in which this discussion is about patronage, but not in the way we normally look at it. It appears to have been generally true that the bishop and the chapter paid for the major building projects I'm going to discuss today. This is confirmed whenever, as in 14th century Exeter or 15th century York, we have enough information to be able to say something meaningful about the funding of such projects. But the detail of who holds the purse strings and makes design decisions is not my primary interest today. What I'm interested in is that a project takes place at all, and in particular that certain kinds of project necessarily involve the cathedral community as a corporation, regardless of the financial arrangements behind them. Likewise, discussions of patronage have tended to look at iconography or architectural detailing or unusual features of a design for clues as to specific patronal influences. The results of these have been invaluable, but my aim today is somewhat different. I want to focus on major building projects. The decision to rebuild an entire arm of a church is a big one. It involves a decade or more of inconvenience and expense. The decision to replace or rebuild the entire structure of the church is even greater. Even a concerted, well-funded project is likely to take more than a single generation. Salisbury took about 40 years, Exeter over 70. So it seems to me that when such a decision takes place, something corporately interesting must be going on. And when a wave of such projects affects several buildings, life gets even more interesting. One ought to inquire further and ask which and when and why.
Excuse me, please, could you speak up?
Oh yes, of course. Sorry, it sounds like it's reverberating beautifully. I'll happily do that. Thank you for asking. From this point of view, is that better? If you're not nodding, then you can't hear, and that doesn't help, does it? From this point of view, the scale of a project is at least as interesting as the stylistic approach taken or the detailing that results. To intervene on matters of style and detail, a patron has to care about more than simply up to date and in budget. He must also have the language to communicate his aesthetic requirements. Of course, there were patrons who could do this, but the decision to replace an east end, a transept, a tower, or an entire church depends on no such assumptions. Neither can it be debated whether patron or mason is the source of the initiative. Much the same could be said of such decisions as to whether to construct a screen facade or not, or to have a crypt or not, or to abandon an apse and replace it with a rectilinear planform. even if some of the recommendations in these respects might have come from designer rather than patron. The implications of this are a running theme of this lecture, and mean I will often refer to the form of a building, to emphasise that it is the basic building blocks of shape and structure that I'm talking about, rather than more detailed, more stylistically specific features. I will also refer, from time to time, to the relative wealth of these institutions as a whole. And I'm now realising that I have a handout which I've forgotten to give out. There's a rule of thumb, ranking order of relative wealth, which is taken by aggregating the figures for income at the time of the Valor Ecclesiasticus, as cited in Knowles and Hadcock's Medieval Religious Houses of England and Wales. It draws chiefly on this and on Tanner's Notitia Monastica, as well as on Dugdale and the VCH. I've added the net income of the community to the gross value of the bishopric to give a rough idea of resources available corporately. Enough questions are raised by the origin and gathering of these figures and the meaning of them to question the precise lineup that results, and I'd counsel strongly against taking the resulting figures and rankings too literally. But surely, in general, it was true that, for example, Canterbury, Winchester, Durham, Lincoln and Wells were among the wealthiest cathedrals, that Norwich, Salisbury and St Paul's could be described as broadly mid-ranking, and Carlisle, Chichester and Rochester were the poorest. Indeed, one only has to picture the scale of each of these buildings to confirm that there is a rough correlation between architectural ambition and the overall resources available to a corporation. With this borne in mind, let us turn to the core group of buildings I want to discuss, which are the 19 churches and their ancillary structures which were built in the medieval period by people who knew them or expected them to be episcopal seats. I'm excluding those cathedrals set up in former monastic churches after the dissolution. I will focus on these buildings in the period from the late 11th century to the Reformation because we don't have sufficient architectural information for earlier periods. Indeed, 17 of these churches are still standing. And knowledge of the two that are missing, Coventry and St Paul's, by and large permits us to say the kinds of things that I want to address today. Indeed, the things we know least about are not so much these, but some of the stages between the 11th century and the point each building reached the state in which it has more or less come down to us, such as the full extent of changes in mid-12th century Lincoln, or exactly how much non-Romanesque fabric existed at Bath before the 1500s. And as I hope is by now obvious, I want to focus on the big picture. There are, of course, contingencies affecting individual buildings that might affect my interpretation. The question is whether they destroy my basic proposal or not. I want to start by looking at this group of buildings as it appeared in the early 16th century. That is, on the eve of the dissolution. At first sight, all this snapshot tells us is that by and large, religious institutions of all kinds will create or aspire to create the most up-to-date and magnificent great churches they can. Things get more interesting, however, when we separate the cathedrals into two groups by looking at the constitution of their chapter. As is well known, in England, between the early 13th century and the dissolution, the cathedral chapters were split into two near equal groups. 10 were monastic, monks, governed by a prior. Bath, Coventry, Canterbury, Durham, Ely, Norwich, Rochester, Winchester and Worcester were Benedictine and Carlisle was Augustinian. The other 9, Chichester, Exeter, Hereford, Lichfield, Lincoln, St Paul's, Salisbury, Wells and York, were secular or collegiate foundations, chapters of canons governed by a dean. The distinction between these two groups was an emphatic one, given that in all the secular cathedrals, the canons were sustained by separate prebends, occupying their own houses within the close. Colleges could be organised in a communal, quasi-monastic manner, but during the period under discussion, this was not the case at any collegiate church that was also a cathedral. There were also some interesting symmetries in the situation. The 2 metropolitan cathedrals, York and Canterbury, were secular and monastic, respectively. After a period of jiggery-pokery in the 12th and early 13th centuries, in 2 sees, Coventry and Lichfield, and Bath and Wells, the bishop had a pair of cathedrals, one monastic, one secular. Of the 2 churches that have effectively vanished, one is monastic, Coventry, and the other secular, St Paul's. Let us turn now to the architecture. Of course, the ancillary complexes created by a monastic community and a secular one differ by definition. In the cathedral priories, the most important conventual buildings, chapter house, dormitory, refectory and other structures, were set in a relatively immutable sequence around the cloister, just as occurred in monastic houses throughout much of Latin Christendom. The secular cathedral closes were quite different, with the houses of the canons positioned around the churchyard like villas in some commemorative parkland. The precise layout varied considerably from place to place, and a secular cathedral might or might not have a cloister or separate subcloses for groups within the community such as chantry priests or vicars choral. Indeed, these structures are particularly interesting because they illustrate an important point about the secular cathedral closes. They change over time. In the early 13th century, for example, the West Country foundations of Exeter, Old Sarum and Wells were the only secular cathedrals to possess cloisters. By the 1520s, only Lichfield and York remained cloister-free. Of course, monastic closes changed too, but their core buildings, the structures which were most essential to their function, were almost immutable. They might be rebuilt, structures of less central importance, none of them unique to monastic houses, might appear within the close, but the main residential complex was not redefined. Here, the secular vicars' closes are particularly interesting because through them we can watch institution and architecture moving in step. Vicars appear in the course of the 12th century. By the end of the 13th, those at Lincoln, St Paul's and York had moved out of their canons' houses and into purpose-built residential complexes within the close. From the mid-14th century, these communities, the first was Wells, began to be formally incorporated as separate institutions within the wider cathedral college. Usually, and in contrast to their chapters, these sub-colleges adopted a communalised arrangement, managing their endowment in a single block and with a common hall as part of the complex. By the early 16th century, every secular cathedral had a separate vicar's close. The mighty churches of York, Wells and St Paul's had a second subclose for chantry priests, and everywhere but Lichfield, the vicars were also constituted as a corporately separate sub-community. Developments, constitutional and architectural, were thus intertwined. Both involved significant acts of corporate will, carving out building plots and sources of income from within existing arrangements. The Polygonal chapter house was perhaps the most artistically interesting of the ancillary structures I'm talking about at the moment. All but two of the seculars had, by the 16th century, constructed one of these palatial buildings. The exceptions were Exeter, which, with its small prebends and large common fund, had the most communalised secular cathedral chapter in England, and Chichester, probably England's poorest secular cathedral. The only monastic cathedrals to have centralised chapter houses, by contrast, were Worcester, where the form had been invented as early as about 1110, and Augustinian Carlisle. In other words, there were polygonal chapter houses at all bar two of the secular cathedrals and broadly rectilinear ones, there's Worcester, at all bar two of the monastic ones. Of course, there were polygonal chapter houses at other kinds of institution too, just as there were many great churches that were not cathedrals. We will return to these. For now, just a couple of brief contextual generalizations. I've identified 20 or so abbeys and priories which were as rich or richer than the poorest cathedral. And in general, both their churches and their ancillary complexes were indistinguishable from those of the cathedral priories. One could go relatively seamlessly from Glastonbury to Winchester or Bury to Norwich. All but a handful of these very wealthy monasteries were Benedictine foundations, ranging in date of origin from the 7th to the earlier 12th centuries. There were, of course, scores more Benedictine houses, and at every level of wealth, from the rich to the poor, and hundreds of monastic houses belonging to other orders, by and large less well off than the Benedictine foundations. The situation with regard to the secular church was very different. Only 6 foundations were richer than the poorest cathedral, and all of these were founded after the mid-14th century. Before that point, only Beverley even began to approach the secular cathedrals in wealth, while Ripon and Southall, though significantly less well off, formed a group that was unique in England. All 3 had vicars' closes. That at Ripon was the only non-cathedral vicars' college to be separately incorporated, and both Southall and Beverley had spectacular polygonal chapter houses. These 3 churches were effectively sub-cathedrals of the Diocese of York, possessing various roles normally only associated with bishops' churches. It seems they went out of their way to create cathedral-like closes. The overwhelming majority of other old collegiate foundations, meanwhile, were significantly poorer than any of these. Only 3 of 30 or more such foundations matched the wealth of Southall and Ripon, and one of these, Crediton, was a former cathedral in its own right. From this, we might hold on to 2 thoughts. Firstly, that the architectural and institutional peers of the monastic cathedrals were perhaps more like them than were their secular equivalents. And second, once again, that change over time is going to be a feature of the collegiate foundations. Let us bear these thoughts in mind and move on, because the patterns are just as interesting and, it seems to me, less widely noted when we turn to the churches themselves, and it's these that I really want to talk about. First, let us look at their west fronts. Those at the secular cathedrals were particularly ambitious. At secular Lincoln, St Paul's, Salisbury and Wells, the very form of these structures was distinctive. These are the famous screen facades. At Exeter, Lichfield and York, the basic form was more traditional. In the former case and cases, a cross-section of the church. In the latter 2, a cross-section of the church with a tower above the western bay of each aisle. However, all these three facades featured a level of sculptural decoration so remarkable that it must have comprised a significant commitment in its own right. Perhaps St. Paul's, where the side towers were not large and the level of enrichment or even completion is not clear, is the most borderline case. On the other hand, it is easy to overlook the extent of the sculptural programme intended for York. These buildings, arguably, and the screen facades unquestionably, had features which must have been required or at least agreed to with very significant consequences by their patrons. The only two secular west fronts that don't truly fit this model are those of Hereford, pressing the wrong button, Hereford. A cross-section west front with lavish surface patterning and a single western tower, and Chichester, a comparatively plain twin-towered affair. Neither required an exceptional kind of commitment from the institution that built them beyond a general sense of architectural fashion at a particular moment and typological appropriateness to a great church. In the monastic cathedrals, by contrast, Bath, Norwich, Winchester, Worcester and Rochester had west fronts of the simple cross-section form which only existed among the secular cathedrals at Exeter. The balance of probability is that this was the case at Carlisle as well. Of these, though Bath comes close in terms of sculptural decoration, only Rochester, with its enormous towerlets, could be described as distinctive in form, though it was arguably outdone in this respect by the single western tower over the best secular comparator, Hereford. Likewise, monastic Canterbury, with its retained 11th century northwest tower, and also Durham, both adopted the traditional twin-towered format, but to less lavishly enriched designs than secular Lichfield or York, if not as plain as Chichester. This leaves two monastic cathedral west fronts. That at Coventry, was apparently the single example of a monastic cathedral screen facade. That at Ely was the only Romanesque cathedral westwork to survive into the late medieval era with its remarkable form reasonably intact. In summary, 7 out of 9 secular facades, Lichfield, Lincoln, Salisbury, Wells, York, Exeter and arguably St. Paul's, can be described as highly enriched, either because of the exceptional scale of their sculptural decoration or their distinctive underlying form, or both. Of the monastic west fronts, only 3, the westwork at Ely, Coventry and perhaps Rochester, can unequivocally be said to be as architecturally distinctive in form or sculptural elaboration as any of these. At the other extreme, the plainness of Norwich and Worcester is particularly striking, as is the relative simplicity of the west fronts of the country's 3 wealthiest monastic cathedrals, Canterbury, Durham and Winchester. When compared to their secular equivalents at York, Lincoln and Wells. I can hear all kinds of yes, buts in your minds. Please bear with me. See what happens to this analysis as we proceed inside. Here, secular Exeter, Lichfield, Lincoln, Salisbury, Wells and York were internally completely Gothic in character. At Hereford, Chichester and St. Paul's, varying amounts of Romanesque fabric were highly visible, the nave of St. Paul's in particular being the equal of the 12th century examples at monastic Norwich and Ely. But all 3 had Gothic high vaults throughout the building. As Hereford and Chichester were also the 2 poorest secular cathedrals, one might take from this that an aspiration to the possession of a complete set of high vaults had come to be shared by the secular cathedrals, especially as such high vaults were not present throughout all the monastic cathedrals. Indeed, monastic Durham and Norwich were buildings whose main interior space was still recognisably Romanesque. This was true of significant areas, the entire nave or transept, or both, at Carlisle, Ely, Rochester, Winchester, and one might add that the list of monastic cathedrals to possess high vaults throughout, Canterbury, Durham and Worcester, had only been added to exceptionally recently, with the transept vaults at Norwich, begun in 1509, and Bath still being rebuilt at the time of the dissolution. To put it another way, Worcester and Canterbury were the only monastic cathedrals at which sufficient architectural work had gone on to render their main internal spaces Gothic from end to end, though Bath was clearly set to join them. It has also been argued that if the dissolution had not occurred when it did, Winchester would have come to join Canterbury and Worcester as an effectively all-Gothic building, retaining only a crypt that was visibly Romanesque. There was, in short, no secular cathedral equivalent for the overwhelmingly Romanesque impression left by visiting Durham, Norwich, or before the 1500s, probably Bath, or the spare impact of the unvaulted naves of Carlisle, Ely, Rochester, and probably Coventry. Not only that, but all Gothic Canterbury and Worcester were episodic structures, their character defined by a series of ambitious but separate projects, sometimes enacted centuries apart. Only at Bath, had it been completed, would a monastic cathedral have been rebuilt in the Gothic era in a single concerted effort. Yet Exeter, Lincoln and Salisbury were all examples of this. And Wells was an end-to-end early Gothic rebuild that had later had its east end replaced. In short, we have 6 effectively all Gothic secular cathedral interiors: Exeter, Lichfield, Lincoln, Salisbury, Wells and York, as against 2 all Gothic monastic ones, Worcester and Bath, with a third, Worcester and Canterbury, with a third, Bath, still underway at the dissolution. Bath was the only monastic cathedral at which a concerted end-to-end Gothic rebuild of a Romanesque great church took place, a phenomenon seen at several secular cathedrals, and Bath was also the only cathedral rebuild to result in a church that was significantly smaller than its predecessor. The phrase, "the exception that proves the rule," might have been invented for it. The spread of buildings which retain substantial Romanesque elements, it may be noted, does not simply map onto a foundation's corporate income. It is true that monastic Rochester and Carlisle, with their Romanesque naves and transepts, were relatively poor, but at least their secular equivalents, Chichester and Hereford, had managed to add high vaults to their churches. And at the wealthiest, only Canterbury had become internally Gothic in its main spaces, a statement which was true of all the wealthiest secular cathedrals. Of course, one can find all kinds of other patterns as one looks closely. Canterbury and York clearly have their eyes on each other architecturally, as do the cathedrals of binary sees at Coventry and Lichfield, Bath and Wells. There is an East Anglian microclimate in which Romanesque great churches of all kinds are retained, even as parish churches are being rebuilt wholesale. There are fascinating architectural conversations between the 3 West Country secular cathedrals. The rash of new lady chapels that appear from the late 12th century and the many renewed or completed towers built in the 15th are seen across institutions of all types. But all this, to me, only makes the secular monastic question more interesting, even if the nature of the interconnections remains to be identified. It seems it is not unfair, even if it is a little cheeky, to stereotype the English cathedrals as they appeared on the eve of the dissolution into two groups: episodic, much-patched monastic cathedrals with significant Romanesque fabric and boring facades. Single-build secular cathedrals, entirely Gothic in style and with very ambitious facades. Like all stereotypes, this flattens out individuality and the exceptional, and in the current climate can even horrify, but I hope it contains an element of truth. I use this term internally Gothic in its main spaces advisedly, because the patterns of retention of Romanesque elements at these two groups of buildings are interesting too. The decision to keep a Romanesque crypt can have various causes. That at Worcester seems to have been more of a structural than a liturgical or devotional necessity. That at Canterbury played a vital role in the devotional geography of the building. By contrast, the Romanesque elements retained at Lincoln and Exeter, the embedded west front and transeptal towers, respectively, feel like rather deliberate decisions, each of them dictating much about the form of the Gothic structure associated with them. The screen facade in one case, the cathedral church on the other, while leaving the visual unity of their interiors uninterrupted. Likewise, it could just be more than happenstance that Durham keeps its most non-Romanesque elements, the Galilee, the Chapel of the Nine Altars, and the towers, relatively sealed off visually from the rest of the church. This may reflect a desire to preserve a sense of antiquity in Cuthbert's great church. It may simply be an acknowledgement of the uncanny power of its 11th century design. In either case, it must have helped that Durham already possessed its precociously early high stone vault. I could add that Durham is a good example of the common late Gothic process which inserted window tracery into Romanesque fabric throughout a church. Later restoration has tended to remove these, making such buildings appear rather more Romanesque than they once did, but that is my point. To refenestrate is not to rebuild. I hope I have said enough to argue that the distinction between secular and monastic cathedrals exists. I was distracted by this simply as a narrative, if you like, for a long time. For a while, I even rather rashly thought there was a single explanation. This theory went that while at both these groups of building the bishop was effectively, indeed in the case of the seculars, increasingly separate from his chapter, there were other patterns. For example, from the 13th century at least, very few bishops were also monks, and most had come up through the secular church. By this time, their chapters were made up of university-educated career churchmen, many of whom moved from preferment to preferment, often fulfilling important administrative roles for crown or church as they did so. Indeed, in spite of their constitutional separation from the bishop, a great many were his archdeacons, or filled other senior diocesan roles, or were simply members of the bishop's familia. Surely, I thought, it is easier to initiate ambitious building works or programs of modernisation, to achieve a consensus about the need for such disruptive projects in such a situation if one has a secular chapter and one is a bishop. I cannot provide direct evidence for this. It's a mixture of common sense and cod sociology, and neither of these are rigorous scholarly disciplines. But the thought is worth bearing in mind because it may come into play in specific situations. The chief problem with that analysis is that were it to always be true, one would expect secular cathedrals to consistently be more architecturally ambitious, or rather to take more architectural initiatives than the monastic ones. It is not that simple. Canterbury, for example, and Worcester renewed their east end on a lavish scale, and their nave likewise rather later. The scale of works at the monastic cathedrals in the 14th century, at Canterbury, Ely, Winchester, Worcester and elsewhere is remarkable. A rough graph, there's Ely, of architectural activity at the two groups of buildings, the methodology for which I can explain on request, shows differences between the two, but not on a very dramatic scale. But phases of difference exist, and they come in waves, and this is what is interesting. It's also perhaps true that the changes in the secular group are in general more radical. Certainly we've seen the piecemeal but dramatic reinvention of secular cathedral closes from the late 12th century onwards. In fact, the situation I have described has two causes, and they relate to these clusters of activity in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and from the late 12th and well into the 13th centuries. Firstly, as will be familiar, the scale of rebuilding which affected the cathedrals in the 40 years or so after the Norman conquest, more specifically after 1070, is quite extraordinary. The only cathedral churches that did not have a single end-to-end rebuild were those where the episcopal seat had been transferred elsewhere, such as Sherborne and Wells. Nothing quite like this has occurred before or since. Of course, the same pattern affected most other great churches as well, and the fact that a complete rebuild took place at every one of the cathedrals is not necessarily significant, though it is remarkable. As will also be familiar, the balance of secular and monastic cathedrals was hugely altered at this period. The priests of the cathedrals at Durham, Rochester and in East Anglia, which was relocated to Norwich, were replaced by monks. Two new sees were created, both again resulting in monastic cathedrals. Ely, and rather belatedly and thus perhaps in slightly different historical circumstances, Carlisle, and two secular cathedrals, Lichfield and Wells, lost their cathedral status to monasteries at Bath and Coventry. Only once did the story go the other way. The monks of Sherborne found themselves no longer in a cathedral priory when secular Old Sarum was created. As a result, between the 1070s and the 1120s, Bath, Carlisle, Durham, Ely, Coventry, Norwich and Rochester joined the 10th century monastic chapters at Winchester, Worcester and Canterbury. There was also change within the secular cathedrals. Communalised secular cathedral chapters, briefly and previously an influential model, were dismantled at Wells and York and left to decay at Exeter. The prebendal system emerged, or was reformed so that the resulting institutional structures were more tightly defined, for example at Lincoln, St Paul's, Old Sarum and York. Without these events, the secular cathedral chapters would have been more varied and less distinct from the monastic ones. What has not been noted, and I apologise, and in particular to Eric for this work in progress here in terms of quality, the hope in general the scales are right, well, I've tried very hard to get them right, is that it seems to have been the case that the monastic cathedral churches created during this era were larger than the secular ones. To take a crude form of estimation, by the first decade of the 12th century, the rough average external length of the 8 monastic cathedrals for which we have dimensions was about 120 metres, while the 7 secular cathedrals averaged about 103 metres. I added St Paul's earlier and it's vanished. Can't explain why. It was a great estimate in any case. That is, the secular cathedrals seem to be on average about 17 metres shorter than the monastic ones. That's about 55 feet. It certainly seems reasonable to claim that secular St Paul's and perhaps York were the only secular cathedrals that could be considered Romanesque giants on the scale of Winchester or Durham or Norwich or post-Anselm Canterbury. the rate of evolution among the secular cathedral chapters from this point and throughout the ensuing century is marked. They became more formally complex, with archdeaconries set up and dignitaries appointed to specific senior roles. They began to employ vicars, and the chapters themselves increased in size. These tend to be 12th century developments. The figures suggest a very considerable increase in endowments. At Wells, a chapter of probably 10 priests in the late 11th century had become 53 by 1206. Old Sarum/Salisbury increased from around 32 under Osmond to well over 50 by the 1220s. And Lincoln, with 21 in the late 11th century, had well over 40 by the mid-12th. It's not possible to say whether these increases were more of a product of the 12th than of the late 11th century, but it is clear that dramatic increases occurred throughout both periods. And we can be confident that the increased complexity of episcopal administration, and particularly the development of canon law, made bishops increasingly dependent on having a body of highly educated clerics at their disposal. All of this surely is part of the background for the remarkable tensions affecting secular and monastic cathedral chapters in the later 12th century. At Lichfield, the fight for parity with Coventry is first seen in 1149 and finally resolved by 1228. Wells's complex story also begins in the mid-12th century and seems to peak under Jocelyn in the early 13th, with litigation from Bath later in that century. Meanwhile, at Coventry and Rochester, in the 1180s and 90s, bishops Hugh de Nonant and Glanville attempted to secularise monastic cathedral chapters. And in Canterbury from 1185, Archbishops Baldwin and his successor, Hubert Walter, attempted to replace the ancient cathedral priory with a secular arch-cathedral, whose chapter was to have been the English bishopric, and which would be constructed at Hackington, and when that project failed, Lambeth, two of the great architectural what-ifs of the medieval era. More permanent was the formal situation in which there were cathedrals at both Coventry and Lichfield, and Bath and Wells, with the bishop's primary residence in each case at the secular seat rather than the monastic one. All this must be a crucial context for the development, which is the key to the distinct architectural characters of the two groups that I outlined earlier. A wave of end-to-end rebuilds, the second greatest in English cathedral history, after that of the late 11th, early 12th century, affected the secular cathedrals in the decades either side of 1200. Wells, from about 1175, was an early example often interpreted in the context of the chapter's bid to regain their close association with the bishop. Lincoln was magnificently rebuilt, saving only the remains of its west front, a project initiated by the monk bishop St Hugh in 1194. Old Sarum was relocated to Salisbury, an intention of the late 12th century begun 2 decades later. The end-to-end rebuilds of the Yorkshire sub-cathedrals, or the Diocese of York sub-cathedrals of Ripon in the later 12th century and Beverley from around 1213 might be added to this list. No such pattern affected the monastic cathedrals, nor would an end-to-end rebuild of such a foundation be initiated until Bath in about 1500. This then was the last period in medieval history when more than one cathedral was being completely rebuilt at the same time. And it is, I suggest, the chief cause of the patterns outlined earlier. In other words, if one takes these buildings out of my previous account, it becomes much harder to sustain the argument that monastic and secular cathedrals have different architectural histories. For example, the magnificent secular screen facades at Lincoln, Salisbury, and Wells are the result of these end-to-end construction projects. The survival of a Romanesque west front at secular Hereford, an indicator that this was a more episodic building, I think the upper parts of the tower were 14th century there. Generally, secular Hereford then could be compared to its monastic peer Rochester in this respect. The survival of the Ely westwork is a symptom of the greater preservation of Romanesque fabric, in this case very late Romanesque, at the monastic cathedrals. The preservation of Romanesque fabric is also a factor in the creation of our plain facades, such as Norwich, but it is also more than that. At Winchester, and possibly Worcester, one can argue for a deliberate late medieval move towards magnificent displays of tracery and internally stained glass, and away from large western blocks of any kind. At Winchester, the westwork was even taken down. In the 12th century, then, something is going on in the institutional status and significance of secular cathedrals, and its architectural ramifications are detectable from the last decades of that century and into the 13th. Its institutional symptoms are plain to see, even if the processes by which they were transformed into architectural consequences are hidden from us. They resulted in a desire to completely replace a series of churches, or a desire at a series of churches, one by one, to initiate complete replacements. And this desire does not seem to have affected the monastic cathedrals. If this suggestion is accepted, one might ask whether the symptoms of this development are not more widespread. Perhaps we could say that the rebuilding of secular Lichfield, which began in the mid-12th century and was not completed until the early 14th, or of York, for the 200 years after Archbishop de Grey's transepts of the 1220s, are not episodic and unconnected campaigns, but simply very slowly completed end-to-end rebuilds. This case has recently been made for York. One might want to see Exeter, the final secular end-to-end rebuild, towers accepted, underway by 1270, as a late example of the same phenomenon. And one might want to ask whether both Wells and Lichfield refined a remarkable new architectural gear around the time their cathedral status seems finally secure, evidenced in the west front and the nave at those buildings respectively. One can also drill down a little further, moving away from end-to-end rebuilds and into the reconstruction of East Ends. This is a universal way of enriching and updating a church from Anselm's Canterbury onwards. Nevertheless, the choir and presbytery of both Durham and Norwich remain substantially Romanesque. The only Romanesque East Ends of the seculars are at the much poorer foundations of Hereford and Chichester, and they're arguably less visibly Romanesque. One might place the gradual Gothicization of the choir and presbytery at Norwich, alongside the rebuilding of Bath and the putative replacement of the Winchester transepts, or Gothicization of the Winchester transepts, as part of a small 16th century wave of Gothicization projects in monastic cathedrals. I'm chancing my arm here, I know. And one might point out that in several secular cathedrals, Lichfield, Lincoln, Old Sarum / Salisbury, if we can be forgiven for treating them as one thing, Wells and York, East Ends were rebuilt in their entirety more than once, an extravagance seen among the monastic cathedrals only at Canterbury, and here apparently only occasioned by an unfortunate fire. These contrasting patterns really are quite striking. The result of this, by the dissolution, was that the 9 secular cathedrals were on average 9 to 11 metres longer than the 10 monastic ones. Given the different historical circumstances affecting these groups of buildings, one should perhaps see this as a rough equalisation of length, or a series of very varied lengths. but it was the result of far more overall growth at the secular than the monastic cathedral churches. There is a sense in which I have now laid out my core proposal, which is that the secular and monastic cathedrals have different architectural histories, that the chief reason for this is the rebuilding of a series of secular cathedrals from the late 12th and into the 13th centuries, and that the context for these rebuildings presumably lies in changes that specifically affected secular cathedral chapters in the course of the 12th century. Underlying that is a sense that the study of patterns of major building programs and of institutional context can throw a useful light on the study of medieval buildings. I would like, however, to take this discussion a little further. What happens if we extend our sample to include other great churches? Let's think of the 20 monasteries which appear to be wealthier than the Cathedral Priory of Carlisle. We have to exclude late foundation Zion, by definition an all-Gothic single build, and another 6 buildings for which we don't have enough evidence. That leaves 13 churches. As far as I can see, only St Mary's, York and Westminster, which stopped 2/3 of the way down the nave, were Gothic end-to-end rebuilds of Romanesque churches. There may have been another at Abingdon. The others were episodic structures, and of these only Chester, Croyland and Glastonbury were effectively Gothic in internal appearance. Gloucester, Fountains and Tewkesbury preserved substantial parts of the Romanesque church, and Peterborough and, with reasonable certainty, Reading, St Augustine's, Canterbury and Bury were effectively Romanesque in overall internal appearance. I mentioned the replacement of East Ends. Among our top 20, only Glastonbury had its East End rebuilt more than once, and, as at Canterbury, this was only as the side effect of a fire. It seems, then, that the cathedral priories are behaving more like their peers, following a great church norm, and in turn further suggesting that something interesting is going on at the secular cathedrals. Here, as we have seen, are 6 colleges wealthier than the present cathedrals are all late, while the wealthiest ancient colleges were themselves effectively sub-cathedrals. This analysis throws even sharper light on the grandeur of Beverley, which matched churches of far greater wealth. Likewise, the Polygonal chapter house. Among the great Benedictine foundations, only Westminster and Evesham are known to have built examples of this palatial building type in the Gothic era. It seems that this form of building is restricted after Worcester to Cistercian houses before the 13th century, into the early 13th century, and houses of regular and secular canons thereafter. In any case, the Lincoln, Beverley, Lichfield, Salisbury, Wells, York, Southall, St Paul's and Hereford sequence, which is by no means blind to other developments, has a narrative conviction of its own, which stretches well into the 14th century. It may even coincide with a phase of secular cathedral history in which many chapters negotiated remarkable levels of independence from their bishops. Various further lines of thought arise from this. One relates to style. I've been using the term all Gothic rebuilds as if style is a factor in my narrative. I should stress that it need not be. It is more germane to my argument that end-to-end rebuilds occurred at all than the style that they employ. But it is interesting that the great 11th century rebuilds and the late 12th, early 13th century secular cathedral aftershock effectively take place either side of the transformation from Romanesque to Gothic. So it is worth emphasising that architectural form is evolving just as rapidly as style in the long 12th century. The Romanesque Great Church might include various features that come at least as much under the category of form as of style. Things such as apsidal east ends, westworks and other western blocks, crypts, galleries, many-towered profiles. All of these had effectively vanished by the early 13th century to be replaced by rectilinear eastern plans, triforiums, churches whose liturgical spaces were all on one floor and the choirs positioned entirely east of the crossing, screen facades, and profiles dominated by one or three massive towers. It had become a near universal aspiration to possess high vaults throughout the church. Other features, of which the eastern transept is the most obvious, appear and disappear in the course of a broad 12th and 13th centuries. These changing ideas about form cannot have escaped any patron. They're fundamental to what is being built. And they potentially add to the concerns of this important era not only an exploration of new stylistic effects, but a rapid development of the features associated with great churches. In other words, they address architectural typology. Observations such as these make the modernity of our secular cathedral rebuilds all the more striking. Plainly, these are spectacular examples of what the great church can be. Can we go further than that and ask whether these buildings are specifically trying to look like cathedrals? Here we really are in the realm of speculation. But others have looked at style rather than at form or rebuilding patterns and made observations that may be relevant. Peter Draper, Virginia Janssen, and Peter Kidson have talked of Salisbury as a model new universal church, as Janssen put it. The stylistic coolness of Salisbury is predated by that of Wells, where Peter Draper has argued it is an element in a conscious attempt to distance that building from the monastic intensity on display at contemporary Canterbury and Glastonbury. That is, to make it more like a secular cathedral, or to propose a model for such an institution. Much bandied about has been the idea of the Episcopal style, which may, if it exists, also be relevant. We should note that there is no sense at all that the great post-11th century, great post-1070 cathedrals are anything other than the grandest of great churches, perhaps accompanied by a sense that the most magnificent such churches should also be monasteries. Nevertheless, they left behind a situation in which most secular cathedrals were rather less overwhelming than most monastic ones architecturally. And our Gothic-era secular cathedral rebuilds really do seem to be a phenomenon affecting the cathedrals in a way that they do not affect other types of foundation. It is possible that they are not only magnificent statements of what the emerging Gothic great church can be, they are specifically a kind of Episcopal great church, if only it is by the setting of an example. The success of their result is palpable if their subsequent architectural history is considered. Here, even more than at, say, Romanesque Norwich or Durham, were buildings that seem to have satisfied all the requirements of a great church for centuries to come. It is thus this institutional point of view and the observations about building history and building form which perhaps most palpably suggest that these projects may not simply be model great churches, they are also, in a sense, model cathedral churches, embodiments of episcopal authority and magnificence, and of secular propriety.